anything.
So the big question is, did Cruz's speech actually backfire? The fallout from former South Carolina GOP Chair Van Hip, Independent Women's Forum Heather Higgins, and former Obama campaign staffer Steve Shell. Van, let me go to you first. Obviously mixed reactions, but we heard on the floor there a lot of booing, a lot of people very upset that Ted Cruz either A, didn't play ball or felt it necessary to release his frustrations at a point where the party was trying to unify.
Charles, we saw last night exactly why he has a tough time getting along with his colleagues in the U.S. Senate. But I think the base is rallying around Donald Trump. I spoke to one very prominent evangelical leader who told me he was for Trump. His wife was undecided. She's for Donald Trump right now. She loved the Pence speech, and she realizes we cannot have a third Obama term. And this evangelical vote is so important, and let me tell you why. And I think Pence helps tremendously with this. Go back and look at 2012. Evangelicals stayed home, and we had a very lower turnout than usual for Mitt Romney in those key swing states like Ohio. Mike Pence, I think, is rallying the evangelical base. Donald Trump can win this thing.
All right, Van, I got you on the Pence part, and I think we all agree on that. But the big controversy today, Steve, is about what Ted Cruz did and if it will have any damage to November. A lot of people say, for the most part, they know he's damaged himself, particularly in the short term, but any lingering effects for Donald Trump?
Yeah, I don't think so. It was interesting. I agree with Van. I mean, most of my Republican friends who were on the floor last night were texting me during the speech saying, wow, the reception of this is horrible. I mean, who could blame Ted Cruz for not wanting to endorse Donald Trump? I mean, the guy, Trump, took a shot at his wife and his dad, but he should have stayed home.
Yeah, he definitely should have stayed home. And Heather, I think that's one of the things we see. Kasich isn't there, and some of the other Republicans who felt like Donald Trump, for whatever reason, doesn't reflect necessarily their values. If that's the way you feel, you don't go to a convention where the idea is to unify the party. And nevertheless, Ted Cruz is the big news today when it probably should have been Mike Pence and some other things.
That's true. The reality is that he was basically doing a longer, slower version of the Paul Ryan slowly coming to adjust his thinking to accepting Donald Trump. Problem is you don't do that at the convention, on the main stage, in prime time. What it did to most of the Republican electorate was, let's be frank, a lot of them were not initially Trump supporters either, and they've gone through a lot of personal wrestling within themselves about the importance of winning, and that means coming together. They're tired of the rancor, and he basically triggered that. Everybody's been working through stages of denial and then anger and bargaining, working through their stages of grief. But he's going more slowly, and the people who are there already were not putting up with that last night.
You know, Van,
kind of like.
Go ahead, Heather. You want to finish?
I was just going to say it's like Director Comey. He made a very strong argument, and Ted made a very strong argument against Hillary Rodham Clinton last night. They both had an obligation to follow through. Neither did for personal reasons, and they've both ended up helping Donald Trump.
You know, of course, Van, this morning Ted Cruz did double down on this, but when he was asked, he talked about the attack on his wife, the attack on his father, and then finished up by saying, "I'm not a servile little puppy dog." Yeah. Is that something that you think Hillary Clinton, because she did tweet last night, vote your conscience, right after he used that term, is this the kind of thing that she can piggyback off and tell the world, listen, even within the Republican Party, the rancor from their nominee is so tough that one of the top candidates decided not to back him?
Charles, he's played right into Hillary Clinton's hands. And I think that's why the base is so fired up. But it was unbelievable. I think it's safe to say that Ted Cruz will not be a contender on the national stage in the future. How a man handles victory and how a man handles defeat tells us a lot about a man. What kind of leader he is, what kind of man he is.
Can I disagree?
Donald Trump was magnanimous. He reached out. And I would contrast this with Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is a class act.
Real quick, Heather, go ahead. I'd like you to...
I just want to disagree. Hillary is not going to be using Ted Cruz because he's not a surprise validator. If Ben Carson were the one who was having a problem with Donald Trump, that would work for her. But Ted Cruz, given the history saying that he's not sure yet, he did say, by the way, that he wouldn't vote for Hillary. Yeah. She's not going to be using him.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, she tweeted last night, and she borrowed his phrase, vote your conscience right away, so I'm not quite sure about that. But let's talk about Governor Mike Pence, because he delivered a real strong speech. He made a strong case for the Republican ticket. I want the audience to take a listen.
You know, the choice couldn't be more clear. Americans can elect someone who literally personifies the failed establishment in Washington, D.C., or we can choose a leader who will fight every day to make America great again. It's change versus status quo. And my fellow Republicans, when Donald Trump becomes president of the United States of America, the change will be huge.
All right, well, we know Hillary Clinton has events in Florida tomorrow where many are wondering what she's going to do. Maybe there's so much pressure from all the attention that that the RNC is getting, she may have to come up with a VP pick right then and there. So, Steve, let's talk about the pressure, because Mike Pence, I think the consensus is out. He's been the ideal pick for Donald Trump, and it does put extra pressure on Hillary, maybe even to come up with her pick tomorrow.
Well, I think tomorrow would be a logical time anyways. I mean, this is basically the day that Donald Trump announced his, the Friday before the convention, so I wouldn't be surprised. And, you know, listen, I think these things tend to be real pass-fail tests, and Mike Pence, you know, passed the test. It's the first question, you know, of presidential leadership, that, you know, who you pick as VP. It was a good pick. I don't know that it'll do a lot for the ticket. I think Hillary Clinton will have a good pick tomorrow.
How does Hillary counter that, though? How does Hillary counter Mike Pence?
Well, you know, I mean, if I were making the pick, I would go with a Bill Sack or a Kane, somebody who's been in the Senate, been a governor. I think it would match up pretty well. But again, this is going to be an election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. I think as long as both nominees pick somebody who can be competent as president, it won't be a race between the VPs.
I don't know, Heather. You know, there was a lot of talk about Donald Trump initially looking for someone, a quote, like a bulldog, or, you know, someone who could really be an attack dog. And for a while, it feels like some of the folks who were auditioning for Hillary Clinton's #2 spot were trying to show that they could be attack dogs, particularly in Elizabeth Warren. I know normally it doesn't sway and move the needle a lot, but this is going to be a tight election. So far, it could mean a lot.
The reason that Pence was such a good pick for Trump, among other things, is if you look at polling among undecideds, independents, women, what they're looking for is to see if they can trust Trump, if they can believe that he is going to be able of bringing people together, moderating his language, being calmer and more presidential. Pence was the perfect pick for showing that. A real foil, a real coming together, just the optics immediately signal all that. Hillary has a different problem. If you talk to the same people, including Democrats, her biggest challenge is that they say that she, over and over again, is a liar and untrustworthy. I don't know what vice presidential pick you pick that solves that problem for you, or creates an optics that you're now suddenly trustworthy.
Maybe she makes a call to Kris Kringle or something, or Santa Claus. But just joking there. Van, I want to go to you last on the point that Heather just brought up, though, with respect to countering Donald Trump's rhetoric throughout the primary, which has hurt him in the polls. Is it incumbent upon him tonight to follow up on that Pence pick by saying the right things with the right tone and maybe reaching out to a broader audience?
Well, I think it is, and show the personal side to Donald Trump. I think his kids have set him up well. I can't wait till Ivanka's introduction. I think she is going to do just as well as her brothers. But those who've known Donald Trump, who've met him, they've seen that personal side. They need to see that. They need to see a strong visionary, a strong leader who's doing this for the right reasons. He realizes that this country is in a world of hurt right now. It's a miracle we've survived the last 8 years of what we've gone through. This is the last election we've got, I think, to save this country. All
right, let's hold it right there. Stay right there, because tonight is the moment that many claimed would never happen. Donald Trump, he will be accepting the Republican nomination. And we're getting word now that the theme of the speech, well, it's going to be a familiar one. Let's go to Peter Barnes in Cleveland with the latest. Peter.
Well, hey, Charles, that's right. Donald Trump will make his big acceptance speech tonight, and the theme of the night is Make America One Again. But officials are saying that the overarching theme of his acceptance speech tonight will go back to his theme of Make America Safe Again. Trump will discuss safety as a foundation for prosperity. He will make the case that by combating terrorism abroad and at home, securing the border and providing safety for U.S. citizens and law enforcement, that the conditions will be set for America to realize its promise. That from a Republican official close to Trump. So we're going to hear about law and order, the wall, reforming and modernizing NATO in the age of ISIS and global terrorism. Also want to let you know that Donald Trump will be appearing at a new podium tonight, his own podium. Right now, the old one appears to be back, but earlier the stagehands had the new podium up. It was wrapped in blue paper to disguise it, so it will make its debut tonight. So watch for that as well. Charles.
All right. I bet you there's already a Twitter account, Trump's Podium. I guarantee it's already out there. Thanks a lot, Peter Barnes. Well,
okay.
Among other things, of course. Yeah, among other things, of course, tonight, Donald Trump will be trying to reach beyond party lines. Heather, he's obviously going to try to nab some of those Bernie Sanders supporters. He's done it almost every time that he's spoken to a large public audience. So what do you think about that?
I think you see it in actually a lot of the other speeches as well.
Yeah.
Many of them have made the case why union workers and others who are minorities and others who are not normally thought of as Republican voters want to cross over. And indeed, if you remember 1980, this has a lot of the same feel, where the most conservatives thought that Reagan wasn't conservative enough. The establishment were very uncomfortable with the nominee, and yet there was this broad swath of the American people who felt that he really spoke to them, their frustrations, their aspirations, and their desire to get their country back on track.
You know,
and that's
Steve,
what Trump is doing.
Steve, I watch the polls constantly, and I don't necessarily see Donald Trump getting a lot of traction with those Bernie voters, but I see Hillary losing a lot of it. And if you go back to 1980, I think voters didn't vote, 9% of them didn't vote for Carter or Ronald Reagan. If that were the case this particular time, it might make the case Van was making earlier. You do the numbers over, you add in enthusiasm, and it sounds like Trump wins this thing.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think the RNC has done a lot to help Democratic unity. I mean, the things I see on Twitter and Facebook, this has been a convention about how brown people are out to hurt Americans, Hispanics are going to hurt Americans. I have no idea how Donald Trump is going to be able to reach out to any minority group after this convention. I mean, I think he's hoping this is entirely an election decided by the base. And if it becomes that kind of election with no turnout, he might be able to win. But I think he's taken any chance of getting broad appeal and throwing it away in this convention.
Well, Van, one thing we do know is law and order is on everybody's mind right now. We see the shootings across the country, the ambush and the assaults on police officers, terrorism around the world, including America. And the bottom line is that we're all victims of that. I think that's a good platform for Donald Trump to reach out to every American. You think that probably will be the central part of his overarching theme?
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear about the theme of the speech tonight. Charles, the reason we have a federal government, the reason the states came together was to provide for the common defense. This election is going to be about electing a commander-in-chief to keep us safe. That's what it's all about. We've got to secure our borders. We've got radical Islam now on this soil. We've had no foreign policy. We've got to think outside the box to prevent the next terrorist attack rather than responding to the last one. And I think Donald Trump is going to make the case for being a strong commander-in-chief to keep this country safe.
Okay, Heather, I'll give you the last word real quick. The wall. Does he pound the table on the wall again tonight, despite what Steve said? It could backfire if he's trying to broaden that tent.
He may well mention the wall, but the way people hear the wall is not the way the left is trying to spin it. It's not about being anti-immigrant. Donald Trump is all for legal immigration. What he's about is taking care of the Americans at home, making sure that resources are spent on the people who are suffering here, making sure that they have jobs, because there's no jobs that Americans won't take. And really, people understand that this is about looking out for them, finally.
All right, guys. Thank you all very